Professor Dennis Culhane is a leading homelessness researcher and social policy expert and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. His work has helped shape how policymakers understand the dynamics of homelessness, particularly through his research on housing first, service utilization, and prevention. He's also the founder of Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, where he's helped lead efforts to use integrated data systems to better inform policy and improve outcomes across housing and social services. Thank you so much for joining me today, Professor Dennis Culhane.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start with your background and the framing and how you got into this industry in the first place. And so you've studied homelessness for decades. What originally drew you to the issue and what has kept you focused on it for such a long time?
Well, I got interested when I was in college. I went to a small Catholic university, Franciscan university called St. Bonaventure. It's in Western New York. And traditionally, the Franciscan order is a group that does a lot of urban ministry, a lot of anti poverty ministry. Um, and so I volunteered for a summer to live and work in their community in Philadelphia, where they have a soup kitchen. They had a couple shelters at the time and a thrift shop. And so I was able to, you know, spend a decent amount of time starting with direct experience working with people who were going through these challenges, and it really kind of focused my attention on the real impacts that poverty had in everyday life. So when I was looking at graduate school options, and I was a senior in college, I decided to apply to a program in uh, social psychology at Boston College that encouraged people to apply their thinking in real world contexts. And so I went there with the idea that I might be able to study homelessness with the support of the faculty there and maybe learn more and get some insights into what was going on.
And when you first began researching homelessness, what were some of the biggest misconceptions in the field? And which of those misconceptions do you still think persist today?
Oh, the biggest misconception, certainly at that time, was that homelessness was a problem of the mental health system and mentally ill people. Um, and while indeed the mental health system has lots of things wrong with it, it was a mischaracterization to argue that a majority, but many researchers at that time were claiming 85-90% of the homeless had mental disorders. And therefore, they were concluding that homelessness was being driven by deinstitutionalization and other policies from the 50s and 60s, um, and that was leading to this homeless problem in the 1980s. And basically, the only people really studying homelessness at that time were psychologists and psychiatrists. So, of course, they have a disciplinary lens, a language, conceptual frameworks, which are all organized around mental health, behavioral health disorders. And so that's the way they see the world. And that really colored public perceptions, I would say, for decades. And to some extent, it still persists today.
And one of the main ways you frame homelessness is as something dynamic, something that changes, rather than some other things that have been, it's been framed as almost a static solution. And what how does that distinction work? What does that distinction change about how policymakers are going to react or pass policy when it's a dynamic condition versus something more static?
Well, if you view the problem as a group of people, that this is um, a static phenomenon where there's so many people who are in this condition, and if you get them out of homelessness one by one, then you'll solve the problem. Um, that's an incorrect view, but that would be one approach. Whereas alternatively, what we know is that homelessness is a highly fluid condition. Most people actually experience homelessness on a short term basis. And chronic homelessness, which is people who are homeless for very long periods of time, is actually sort of the exception relative to the number of people who are coming and going through homeless programs. Um, but obviously, people's everyday experience with people who are visible as homeless, people they can recognize as homeless, they are attracted to the people who they see living in public, people who are unsheltered and who have appeared to have been there for some time. So that colors the public perception, but it's actually quite inaccurate. And so you have to sort of have this more dynamic vision of how the different entry flows are, what the exit flows are, what enables people to avoid entry, what enables people to find an exit. So those are the things that we need to understand if you're trying to mitigate the problem.
And I definitely agree with you. I've heard a lot on many of the people I've had who I've interviewed have said something that there is the entrance rate to homelessness, like you mentioned, and the exit rate. And the entrance rate is so much higher than the exit rate that it's trying to, like, it's like collecting water in a bathtub and you're trying to scoop out as
Mm.
much water as you can. But if the faucet remains on, it's never going to be empty. And so, focusing on that. And one thing I realized, especially when I first moved to Manhattan, is that the visible impact of homelessness on people is so substantial. When I was living in Boston, it's not like there wasn't any homelessness, but because I didn't see it firsthand, I thought that, for the majority of it, it didn't exist or it was very, very minimal. Seeing it firsthand, like you says, colors the public perception. And to some extent, it can color in a good way in that they understand the issue. But then once you become so hooked on just the people on the streets and the people that you see, you tend to forget the bigger picture, which is that there's a lot of hidden homelessness. There are people who are couch surfing. There are people who may have found a shelter that one night, but won't find a shelter the next. There are people who, aren't even in Manhattan and are trying to find homes in California and Arizona and New Mexico and other states across the United States. And so it's definitely something a lot more dynamic. And I think that's a big issue today, especially with how homelessness is portrayed in both the media and in people's eyes. And so, like I mentioned, a lot of the public conversation is driven by visible street factors and street homelessness. What does the data tell us that the public misses?
So there's a lot of variation, by the way, geographically, with regard to the portion of the homeless population that is sheltered versus unsheltered. And the visible aspect of homelessness is typically the unsheltered population. And we have a huge range in that. We have some communities that have, 5% or fewer of their homeless population are unsheltered. These would be cities principally in the Northeast and Midwest. And then we have other parts of the country, like in the South and in the Southwest and West, where the rates of unsheltered homelessness are much higher. And therefore, the visibility is much more pronounced. And so it definitely changes your sense of the dimensions of the problem. So, um, and uh, and just to give you an example, like in a place like Philadelphia, about 5 to 7% of our adult homeless population is unsheltered on a given day, meaning that 93 to 95% are in a shelter, and therefore you don't see them. Um, and the unsheltered population is maybe 6 to 800 people, whereas the sheltered population, about 15,000 people will go through the Philadelphia shelter system every year. So 15,000 is a far larger number than 6 to 800. So if your information is based on the people you see, you're getting a picture of what is, like I say, about only about 5% of the population is actually fits the profile that you're seeing.
And I know you just gave one of these, but if you could think of one statistic or one trend that you think, the public needs to know or needs to hear about that is, either misunderstood, misused, or just not well known in the field of homelessness, what would that be?
Well, I think there's more than one, but certainly the one we've been discussing. Let's just deal with that, which is that exactly who's experiencing homelessness. That's so highly skewed by these visually informed stereotypes. So one would certainly be to help people realize that, first of all, the lack of access to affordable housing is the common denominator for everyone. That includes people who are homeless for an emergency, like they've had some kind of catastrophic loss of housing. Maybe they had a fire. Maybe they had a conflict with their family, a family disruption. Maybe they had a sudden injury, uh, where they got evicted for whatever reason. So there are a lot of triggering events that disrupt people's housing stability. And for most people who have perhaps they have insurance, they have other resources, um, they can recover from that kind of emergency and, find another place to live quickly. But there are some people who don't, or they find a place, but it's temporary, and then they have to move from place to place to place, and eventually they run out of options, and they have to turn to the public sector to find, some kind of charitable system or a publicly funded bed where they can go. So, uh, that's the distinction of what's a triggering event versus what's the underlying cause here, which is the lack of access to affordable housing. Because if these folks had resources, if they had income, if they had emergency resources that they could then use to get into another apartment, then they would do so. But people who are very low income and people who are poor, people who are destitute, of course, don't have that option, and that so that results in these episodes of homelessness. But as we say, most of those episodes are relatively brief, depending on what community. But about nationally, I think we see about half of the people who experience homelessness do so for less than 8 weeks. And so it's just a couple months that they're experiencing that homelessness, and that but the people who can't get out, okay, so again, most people get themselves out, they pick themselves up by their bootstraps, or they kiss and make up, or whatever it is that they fix a situation. But there's a group of people who struggle to do that, and that tends to be people who have behavioral health disorders. They have mental illnesses, or they have a substance use disorders, for example, which are making it more difficult for them to find a new living arrangement where they can go. They may need access to treatment to recover from their situation. They may need actual formal social service assistance and housing subsidies to get into a place, because they're not going to be able to do that without formal assistance. And so that's why we treat people who are in a chronically homeless situation with a very specific set of programs that have been very successful in ending homelessness.
I want to focus a bit on your work at the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. And so you've been a major leader in integrated administrative data systems. For people unfamiliar with this work, what does that mean, and how does linked data reveal something that traditional systems don't?
So, my approach to research, which I think was pretty unusual when I first started it, I don't think there were many people at all doing the approach I was using, at least for the first 10 years that I was doing it, was using what we call administrative data to understand the dynamics of homelessness. Administrative data are the records that government collects and creates through their business processes of running various organizations. So, when take a place like New York or Philadelphia, where they have these large shelter systems, they have to have a process for getting someone on an intake. Like, they have to get their information. They have to then assign them to a location where they may be receiving shelter. They have to reimburse that provider for the cost of that shelter. Uh, and so there's a record that's created for each episode of homelessness and for each person who has an episode of homelessness. And what that does is it creates a longitudinal picture of all the people coming in, how it changes by season, the duration that people are there, some basic demographic characteristics about who they are, why they're here. Um, who's leaving, and what are the destinations they're going to when they leave. So it gives us this incredible, as I say, longitudinal picture. And whereas to that time when I started, all of the research was cross sectional. And so the analogy I would give you, what is that, like a snapshot gives you a picture of a person at a time and place, a given place and time. Whereas a documentary film gives you the much longer view of that person, other people coming and going, and what's happening. And so it was a much better base of information to get a social science understanding. So that was number one. New York and Philadelphia were the only two cities in the United States in 1990 who had a system like this. And so I published my first papers around 93, 94, and spent about 6 or 7 years just trying to do analyses of those data from demographics and dynamics, entry, exit, etc. But the real power of the data was linking it with other data sources that could better inform why people were experiencing homelessness. What other social systems were they touching? Which systems were failing and in fact were actually sending people into homelessness. So by linking the homeless records, we had people's names, birth dates, and social security numbers. We could match it up with prison records, hospital records, or Medicaid paid insurance claims, or child welfare data sets of who was in foster care, who's coming out of foster care. Um, we could match up with birth records, death records, disease registries, school attendance and achievement, employment and earnings histories, um, housing placement histories. Uh, so in other words, by linking these data sets, we could take not just this longitudinal picture of homelessness, but we could see the broader context of social programs that they were touching and what was contributing to homelessness, how homelessness was impacting those systems, and eventually how much was it costing. So it gave us a handle on how expensive homelessness was to society through these processes. Um, so when I did that, it took a given project, like let's say I did a project in New York in 2000, um, and I had 8 data sources that were in that project. Okay, some criminal justice, health, housing, but and homelessness, etc. And it took 4 years to get the approvals to do that project, not to do the project. Once we had the data, you could do the project in 6 to 9 months probably. Um, but it took 4 years to get permission from all the agencies.
Wow.
So this seemed like, and then if once you were done, and let's say you wanted to do the study again a couple years later or do a different version of it, you had to start those agreements all over again. And as the years were going by, it was getting harder and harder and harder to get the lawyers to approve sharing data with external researchers because there was a risk of redisclosure. These are highly confidential records, patient information, social service client information, student, taxpayer. I mean, these are records that are protected by federal law. Uh, so I came up with this idea of creating a data linkage system that where all of those policies and procedures were established. There was an agreed upon framework for how requests could be fielded, how they would be processed, approved or disapproved, how the data provision would be executed to, and how access would be created in a secure way, and how results could be reviewed by the data owners. And that's what we call an integrated data system. And so we built one. My colleague of mine, John Fantuzzo, we were the leads to build one here in Philadelphia. Um, there were a couple others in the country at the time, notably Allegheny County, which is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the state of South Carolina, and the state of Washington. Those were the other two big ones. There was also Cuyahoga County, also had a system through Case Western University. So, in any event, we started to meet as a group, the sites that were doing this, to learn from each other. And that became AISP, Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, because we realized that there was a lot of shared wisdom and experience that could help other jurisdictions. And the MacArthur Foundation gave us 10 years of funding to try to build out a field of practice where other states and counties who wanted to be able to do this kind of data linkage work, not necessarily for homelessness, but for any social issue, studying school dropouts, studying child welfare dynamics, juvenile justice, you name it, you could do all sorts of research projects. Once you had this infrastructure in place, you could do a lot of projects. And so that's what AISP does. We help state and local governments put together the legal agreements and the policies and procedures for these things, how to deal with the ethical issues, community engagement, because you're using people's information. You don't have their consent to do so. So you do have to inform the public as well as you can how their information is being used, how it's being held carefully and safely. um, and then being able to create usable results, actionable results that can improve programs for people, become more efficient, and just be more successful. So that's basically what AISP does, and we have now 27 states and 23 large counties that are in our network who have these integrated data systems.
Wow, that's super impressive from the first four that you had to now having 27 states and 23 larger counties. I have to ask, do you have a specific sort of story or moment where, when one state or county, took on the advice and took on the plan that you'd given them through AISP and, really worked and it really, changed how that community was dealing with homelessness?
Well, homelessness is just one topic they might use. So I would say that the first big project I did in New York City, which showed how expensive chronic homelessness was. So the average person in today's dollars was average chronically homeless person was using $70,000 a year in services when you tallied up the amount they spent in emergency rooms, in hospitals, or in jails, or in shelters, etc. And that when people were placed in housing, they reduced their use of those services dramatically because they didn't go to the hospital anymore. They had an outpatient appointments, and they weren't getting arrested all the time, etc. They didn't have to stay in a shelter, which is expensive compared to an apartment. Um, so costs went down, and basically, the reduced use of these other systems meant that it was effectively break even, um, this is specifically for people with severe mental illness, because they are more expensive than the typical homeless person. They People with severe mental illness spend considerable time in hospitals. Um, on average. They have very long hospital stays. So in any event, that was an insight, right? And that helped to inspire, we probably got two big federal programs that together did about 150,000 funded housing placements as a result of that study. Um, but then there have been many others, like, every community is using these data for early childhood projects, finding where are the childcare deserts, where there's not really high quality daycare programs, and where are the kids who most need access to these early enrichment programs because of challenges they've already had before they're 5 years old, which we can see in these administrative records. Who's had negative birth outcomes, for example, or they may have had child developmental challenges, or they've had homelessness experiences. They may have had an abuse or neglect situation. They could have had a lead poisoning. So we identify where these kids are who are at very high risk of not having early success in school, and matching up, making sure the programs are available. My colleague John Fantuzzo and his team at Penn Child basically did this project in Philadelphia. But literally every city, every state can give you many examples like that.
Wow, that's amazing and super inspiring to hear. Another sort of add-on or follow-up question I have to that is, what is some of the, struggles or hard challenges that you see that happen when these cities try to take on AISB? Like, the first couple of, any barriers that they have to pass through, or is it fairly smooth sailing throughout the whole process?
The two main ones are a lack of trust. Um, a lot of these agencies, they work very independently. They may not trust each other or their motivations. They may feel like the data is going to be used against them. And so a lot of it is about a trust building process and having a um, set of policies and procedures that reinforce the trust. So that's one. But the second, and very common, is that there are lawyers who in these agencies are very reluctant to approve any data sharing projects. So we found we had to get our own legal team here, who have expertise in privacy law, who know the field and what is permissible and how and why. And so we've had to, it's a constant process of educating the agency attorneys on what they can and can't do.
Wow. I mean, and truly what you're describing here is something I've heard a lot, which is almost like prevention, like dealing with a problem before it happens, having the data, like you're describing
Right.
with the child deserts, whether it's, homelessness, childcare, education, any of the issues that AISP deals with, making sure that they get solved or limited or dealt with before it becomes a more serious issue. And
That's
you've
right.
written extensively
Ideally,
about this and dealt with it, obviously. Um, about moving from, now where we have a more crisis response system, I would say, towards a more prevention oriented system. And so, what is so important about prevention? Why is it hard to actually create it and go towards it? And what do you think it would look like if we had truly prevention centered homelessness?
so you've undoubtedly heard the aphorism of Ben Franklin: "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." He was a
Yeah.
very practical person, and it's true that prevention is a low cost activity, relatively speaking. If someone is facing eviction and they have a couple months of back rent that needs to be paid, it's far easier to help them cover that rent than have them come into a homeless system where the cost of shelter, let's say for a family, could be $50,000 or $60,000 a year. Okay, so even a month of being in a shelter is going to be more expensive than helping people to address their problem. So there are obvious things that are sort of right at the front door of the shelter system, um, where we can, as we say, divert people from coming in through some kind of emergency cash assistance, maybe emergency legal assistance, um, relocation assistance, whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of activity there that could be done, and the homeless assistance programs um, should have some resources to help do that, because it saves money for the homeless assistance programs to cover people for whom they can't prevent that kind of situation. But there's also a earlier, upstream set of factors where the homeless assistance programs, we don't have the money or the reach to like solve the problem of all the people who come out of prison and have nowhere to stay. Okay. But the prison system, which has just maybe spent 60, $70,000 a year on a person who's been there, who knows, 2, 3, 5, 10 years. Okay. So they've spent a lot of money on the care of this person. And then they just let them out the door, and they get the proverbial $60 and a one-way bus ticket and a change of clothes. And it's like, good luck. Um, and where there really should be a more thoughtful planning process with individuals who are coming out of prison, let's say, to make sure that they have a place to go and that there's work has been done to find family members, friends, or even a shared living situation, because there are prisoner reentry programs where people can also go if they don't have family or friends to go to. So making sure there's enough of those slots and that those exist and that there's a funding stream to get people into that. So that's the more important prevention, in the sense of it helps a much larger group of people earlier on. So we're not, they're not just coming to the homeless system. And by the way, the number one place where people stay from an institution, a single adult, is coming out of correctional facility. Um, but we have also people who are in detox, like they may have a substance use disorder, they maybe had an overdose. They get a emergency room admission, and it's usually called detoxification. But then they're usually just discharged. They have nowhere to send them, and they usually just say, "Well, here's the address of the shelters. You can go there." So we have a number of these systems that are feeding into homelessness because they're not doing enough to help their clients transition back to housing, or providing even emergency treatment oriented housing for them. And so, the homeless system ends up having to take on responsibility for a very diverse, complex population, many of who have significant needs, and for which these homeless services are not designed to address. So, by its nature, homelessness has to. A lot of the problems that present within the homeless population really have to be addressed by other agency partners. Um, who have the knowledge, the skills, and in many cases, the resources, although many of them are also short of resources.
And of course, funding is one of the biggest issues out there right now. Most recently, I think back in this past December or earlier this year, funding cuts were released for certain programs, especially those related to homelessness, where some programs of people who I have interviewed were cut by almost 30%. And when you're already facing low funding, a 30% cut does you no good. Um,
Right, right, right.
and it's so hard. And then, like you mentioned, when the homelessness services get so many people of different backgrounds, they have to adapt because they're trying to do their best to treat everyone or give everyone as many resources and attention and put them back in the best place that they possibly can. And so they're adapting to different circumstances, and if there's not enough resources to do that, it's just not going to end well for anyone. And so,
Exactly.
with so many issues out there, I mean, and I've gotten kind of shocked at this myself. When I was first learning about homelessness, I was like, people are homeless, they run out of money, and that's what happens. But having interviewed many people, I've realized that it's this amalgamation of tens of hundreds of different causes in different areas of our ecosystem that leads to people becoming homeless. And so I asked this question to a lot of people, and I'm excited to hear your answer. If you are sort of the mayor, or you're running a city, and you really want to meaningfully reduce homelessness in the next 5 to 10 years, what's the first thing that you're going to invest in?
Rental assistance.
Okay.
I use the analogy of like hunger,
Mm.
right? If you want to solve hunger, at some point you're going to have to get food into the mouths of hungry people. And then in the case of homelessness, if you're going to solve their housing problem, someone's going to have to help with the rent. That's it. It's actually quite simple in that regard. And all success in reducing homelessness is going to be tied to the extent to which you're providing rental assistance. All the other services in the world, mental health services, substance abuse services, child welfare services, parenting supports, youth supports, all of those things may help people in certain ways, but they're not getting them into an apartment. And it should not be confused as a solution to homelessness to think that you're doing. Plus, the other thing is we talked about most people are homeless for a short period of time. So having the shelter system be the place where people are supposed to access these services is very short-sighted because most people are not homeless most of the time. It's an emergency crisis situation, and we should be helping people resolve that crisis. That's what homeless assistance is, the only entity that's designed and motivated to do that. And all of the other agencies have to do their jobs to help make sure that's a success and helping people to sustain independently, get the services they need. But what we can do within the homeless assistance programs is we can be the place that helps people get back into housing. And that should be our primary fundamental obligation and what we do and what we do best.
Rental assistance. I almost predicted that answer, and as a wonderful follow up to the next point I want to focus on, which is in one of my first podcasts, I was honored enough to interview Dr. Samson Barris, who sort of created the housing first strategy that has sort of pioneered the way we look at homelessness in the modern world. And when you mentioned rental assistance, my mind went straight there because, well, one of their main goals, although perhaps slightly different, is to get people into housing. That is that first goal. That sort of, if you're hungry, we get you food, and that taking that first very obvious step. However, there are many sort of critics and people who don't believe in the system, who have many misconceptions, and so I want to ask you, what do critics, in your view, what do critics most often misunderstand about housing first, and how can we reframe it such that we convey our point in a much more clean way?
I did a study last year with some colleagues um, that I think shed important light on the challenge for housing first. And what it is it's not that the program doesn't work. The programs have 85% success rate. So there are some people for whom that specific program, at least for that time in their life, and their situation is not going to work. Okay, so we first of all have to acknowledge that there are some people who need a higher level of care. They may need a nursing home. They may even or need assisted living. They need more supervision. There are definitely people who can't live on their own in an independent apartment in the community. And so that is something we've obviously observed, and we have to have contingency plans for people for whom that happens. Um, but the bigger problem is that with the limited resources that go to homelessness and to rehousing people, only 15% of the people who come into homelessness are getting any rental assistance to exit. The other 85% have to figure it out on their own. They are not getting any rental assistance. So we need to really scale that up. And if you look at, compare that to veterans, 65% of veterans are going to get rental assistance to get out of homelessness, of one type, 50% permanent support and housing. So, we've reduced veteran homelessness by 55%, between 2010 and 2020, 2022. And so we know that works, but you have to have scale. So the problem, in a word, is scalability. We are not at a scalable place with regard to housing first. It would require another $10 billion annually for us to close the gap between supply and demand.
And you've done very important work and extensive work on aging homelessness. And so, how is this ever so slightly or largely different than the homelessness that we'll see with maybe the younger population? And why is the rise of older adults experiencing homelessness such a significant and under discussed trend?
So, elderly homelessness is really quite rare in the United States until relatively recently, and that's because we have a pretty good social security system that protects aging people from poverty, but it has a lot of imperfections. But the main thing is that what we've been observing for almost 40 years now is that the bulk of the adult homeless population is a what we call a cohort effect, a birth cohort effect. People born between 1955 and 1965, which would be like the second half of the post-war baby boom, they are the people who have been the dominant homeless population since the mid 1980s. And now they are themselves in their 60s, going into their 70s. And so it's basically the aging progression of this cohort that is associated with this. Now, what we have is elderly homelessness is the fastest growing group, but they're also the fastest dying group. So we have a window here of elderly homelessness that's going to shrink and go away. Um, and we do not see a comparable cohort effect behind them. So we actually may see a net decline in homelessness of about 20% over the next 10 years, just as a function of the dying off of this population.
Wow. I always like to sort of, as we wind down these podcasts, really focus on topics that we might not always get to it that I didn't get to ask about earlier, or may not exactly fall under your line of expertise. And so the first one I have is about the media. One of the biggest things that I have seen is whether it's me starting my own podcast or the Invisible People's podcast. Shout out Mark Horvath, that's quite popular, and I love watching his videos. Is that we need to focus on winning the war on the media because that's how you change public perception. How do you think, if you could change one thing or contribute one message to the homelessness community, what would it be and how would it change the public perception of our current media?
Well, I think I definitely need to change our messaging strategy, and really try to drive home 2 points, which is that we have a lot of broken social systems that, if we're not fixing them, homelessness is what results. Okay. So we don't have access to substance abuse treatment beds. We don't have sufficient access to behavioral health or mental health treatment beds. People who are severely mentally ill do not get a rental assistance voucher by virtue of their disability. People who are getting disability assistance, that in many cases it's 30-40% below the poverty level. So we have all these broken safety nets that you know homelessness is, we only know about their homelessness because when they fail they end up in the homeless system. So number one, we need to find those main five drivers, and we know them, and we need to be very focused on fixing each and every one of them. And then on the homeless assist side, for the people who do become homeless, we know that rental assistance is what gets them out. So if we were able to communicate that we need rental assistance to get people out of homelessness, but we need to fix the safety nets to stop this thing from happening, those would be the two things I would say we need to communicate.
Now, with the sort of modern tech world and with tech advancements, we obviously have the influx and usage of AI and LLMs. How do you think the homelessness services system and industry should incorporate AI or should not incorporate AI? And how do you think it could help or harm how we deal with the homelessness intake?
Throughout history, uh, people have always felt that more information, better, disaggregation of groups is going to be our solution to poverty. And it's never true. So, whatever the latest new technological gimmick is not going to solve homelessness. It's all about resources, and the funding that's going to enable us to have a sufficiently strong safety net, but also when it fails, that we can get people out and back into housing as quickly as possible. And we do have a larger housing affordability crisis. We can't deny that. That's the fundamental reason why prices are so high and why people can't access even the units that are there. So that's a long-term part of the safety net problem that has to be fixed as well. Um, but yeah, I think that we can do a lot better.
After decades of this work, what gives you hope, or have you lost hope that homelessness can still be solved? And what keeps you going?
We've had great success actually in reducing homelessness. Every time we've mounted an initiative that has focused on getting people the rental assistance they need and the support services to sustain. Every time we've done that, we've been successful. So we had a chronic homeless initiative under the Bush administration. We had the veteran homeless initiative under the Obama administration, both of which very successful in reducing the numbers of people who are homeless. Uh, we've had a reformed way of approaching family homelessness that's cut family homelessness by 35% since 2010, um, as a result of reducing the time they spend homeless and increasing the funding to get them out. So um, every time we've been very intentional and we've resourced the changes we want, we have seen progress. And so I believe that we're continuing to move in that direction. I would hope we are, and that hopefully we can convince people that you know we do know what we're talking about and we can succeed because we already have succeeded. Millions of people have ended their homelessness as a result of these programs that have worked effectively for them.
What message or words of advice you have for the next generation, as and especially for the people who want to get into social help, social policy, whether it's specifically homelessness or any of the number of issues that we need to solve?
I think educate yourself, read the research, do your own research, gather information. Always listen to the people who are experiencing these problems directly, um, and don't assume that your background or your expertise as a business person or whatever means that you somehow know what the solution is for a lot of these things. You have to do a lot of listening, and that's what research in many cases is. It's really listening, in part, um, and that you are staying very grounded uh, with the realities that people face, and being very practical. Because I think people, come up with theories and ideas, and in many cases they sort of lose hold of, what the actual nature of the problem is. And don't assume that just because you think you're doing good, that what you're going to do is going to be helpful. And I always cite uh, the quote that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So it's not enough that you're well intended. You have to really know, does that intention actually match reality, and is it really going to help? Because most of the terrible things that have been done to people by government have been well intended reforms, whether that's in criminal justice or mental health, child welfare. A lot of these systems, their worst practices were created initially as efforts intended to help. So it's a caution.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions. That one will definitely stick with all of us. A focus on resources and research. That is definitely one of the big takeaways from this podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today, Professor
You're
Culhane.
welcome.
Really appreciate you sharing your
No
experience.
problem, Vaden. Good luck with you.
Thank you.